I'm Richard Evans. I'm the Provost of Gresham College. And for those of you who don't know it, Gresham College was founded by Sir Thomas Gresham, the Elizabethan financier, in 1597. It's been supported ever since then by the Mercers Company and the City of London Corporation. And its mission from the beginning, continuing now, is to offer free public lectures. We have a very extensive programme. You can visit our website and either view the lectures online or see what's coming up and then come along. So, as part of our remit to entertain and inform the citizens of London and visitors to London, we are mounting tonight a debate on the referendum, the upcoming referendum to whether the UK should leave the European Union or remain. And we have 4 speakers, but you will see we at the moment have 3. That is because our first speaker, who was designed to asked to propose the motion, Dominic Grieve MP, has unfortunately been delayed by a vote in the House of Commons. And of course, we wouldn't want to interrupt the democratic process wherever it happens. So Dominic Grieve is a Conservative politician. He's held a number of offices in the Shadow Cabinet and the Cabinet. He's been Attorney General, he's a member of the Standards and Privilege Committee in the House of Commons, and he will, I hope, turn up very soon. Matthew Elliott, who's opposing the motion, is the founder and chief executive of Business for Britain and the chief executive of the Vote Leave campaign. Sir Geoffrey Nice, QC, is the Gresham Professor of Law, and he's been a barrister since 1971, and he has particularly on the Yugoslav War Crimes Tribunal. And finally, Professor Daniel Hodson is a Mercer School Memorial Professor of Commerce between 1999 and 2002, former Master Mercer. What we've asked you to do is to record your opinion on the motion. This House believes that the United Kingdom should remain a member of the European Union. We've asked you to record your vote on a pink slip of paper, and when you go out, we'll ask you to fill in another slip of paper, which you should have before you, so that we can see whether the debate has swayed your opinion or whether you obdurately stick to the views that you came in. Now, because Dominic Grieve has not been able to come so far, I want to ask Sir Geoffrey Nice, QC, to kick off for the motion. Then I'll ask Matthew Elliott to propose, and if Dominic Grieve still hasn't arrived, then Daniel Hodson to go, and then if he still hasn't arrived, then we will have a volunteer from the audience. If you don't have to put up your hands, it's already been arranged. So may I ask, therefore, Sir Geoffrey Nice, QC, to propose the motion in this House that believes that the United Kingdom should remain a member of the European Union. Geoffrey.
To some extent, I'd planned with Dominic the composition of our 2 presentations, so I suppose there will be a little disconnect, but never mind. You live in a row of houses. One house here, one house there, neighbours opposite. Behind your back garden, some more gardens, some more houses. You have quite a lot of neighbours. You like some of them, you're neutral about others. You dislike those who play the music too loudly, or have bonfires when you've got washing on the line, or who treat their children badly in the garden, or worse still, treat their dogs badly in the garden, which you don't feel very strongly about. Go back 73 years, and a doodlebug bomb arrives in your street. A house catches fire. There's a child on the top floor. And all the neighbours gather together, some bravely, and rescue the child. Then you will feel strongly about your neighbours. You will have passion for them. But that apart, it's much easier, more natural, to dislike your neighbours a little bit or a lot. And that may be why in this debate, you may judge, sometimes passion seems to come more strongly from the outers than from the inners. You won't hear any passion from me, not only because I don't believe in self-assertion of passion, because it may be to give false collateral simply to a state of mind of my own, and because passion is no guarantee of the accuracy of the underlying belief. So you'll hear little of passion from me. But what is important, in my view, is to recognize that underlying the referendum to which we have been put by our political leaders is in large part the good neighbour principle, which finds its exposition in various good books. And it was quite interesting, as you compare the non-passion maybe of the inners and the passion of the outers, to have read an article in the New York Times by Roger Cohen a couple of weeks ago, contrasting Donald Trump and his passion, his visceral, his gut approach to politics with our own new mayor, Sadiq Khan. And in the course of his comparison of these two different approaches to politics, Roger Cohen reminded us of what Freud said about the impossibility of overlooking the extent to which civilization is built on the renunciation of instinct. Our approach to neighbours is sometimes only a matter of instinct. So no passion from me. Nor, come to that, will you hear very much from me about money. Not just because it looks as though the money argument's been won, more or less, because I'm not sure it's that important. At least not for me. When I say it's won, I'm saying no more than that it appears that the majority of independent people hold views that express that there are financial risks, employment risks, in quitting the EU. I can't assess those opinions, can you? Most of you probably got university educations. Can you assess these competing arguments that we've been compelled to confront as voters by politicians who haven't done for us what they would want done for them, namely to have presented objective briefing documents that narrow down the issues? No, we've got one side and the other. But never mind. The majority, it would appear, inclined towards the view that there will be financial damage done by leaving. But I don't think it's that important. For me, yes, of course, I should consider that as an argument if it was the concern of other people who would lose their jobs and lose their money. But for me, should I be making my mind up on this important issue simply because my house might decline by 10 or 20% in value? No, I don't think so. The issue is more important than that. And this is a referendum to which we should never have been put as an electorate, because we can't deal with the detailed issues, but we now have to, and because we have not been provided with the briefing papers that would have served the purpose well. It seems to me that the two principal issues that trouble people, apart from money, and it may well be that Dominic, who I'm happy to see has now arrived, will deal with these matters in more detail. It seems to me the issues that most trouble people are probably immigration or migration, and also to some extent the law. On the immigration issue, what can one say? Well, we can go back and look at the way we seemed unable to drive our own buses in the 60s, I suppose? well, that group was necessary and assimilated. We were happy to assimilate the Ugandan Asians with their very particular skills. And now we understand that immigration is a net contributor financially. There are other problems of immigration and migration arising from international crises, and the question there is whether we should put our own selfish interests ahead of treating our fellow humans in a neighbourly way. My very short answer to this problem would be that it is far better that we do treat them in a neighbourly way, and that because the problem is so large, it's preferable that we deal with it on as large a basis as we can. I don't want to engage in the threatening talk of hordes coming across when the effective barrier to England is moved from Calais back to Folkestone. Irrelevant to me. The issue is whether this problem should be dealt with on a national or on a larger basis when there is a homogeneity in Northern Europe, or in Europe generally, that should be coping with this as a joint problem and not as a single one. When it comes to the law, and I think, Provost, I've got how many minutes left?
About 3.
When it comes to the law, there's something very important to observe about the competing European bodies that it is said interfere with our law. One advantage of this referendum has been that people have understood that the ECHR, the European Court of Human Rights, and the convention that it is based on, has got nothing to do with the EU. And slowly people are understanding that that legal process is not one that has power to overturn English laws. It has the power to make decisions that should be respected and that then are dealt with by the English courts. The European Court of Justice, reflecting EU law, may have more power, but it too is underpinned by a convention that gives rights to individuals, indeed often wider rights than are given by the first convention. And the more general point, which can be explored by consideration of cases in both courts, is that the process of law is not something that is easy. It's not something that any particular state can simply say, we know the answer to these problems, this is the answer, these are the answers. Law is a technical issue, and it's an issue that involves philosophy as well as law and politics and the culture of the people concerned. Laws change slowly and over time and by a dialogue between the various interested groups. And as we may discover in discussion more than now, these courts allow for that process of discussion and gradual change that leads to the reflection of the real interests of the people. And many of these issues, whether it's abortion or immigration, whether it's votes for prisoners, or whether it's whole life sentences, are difficult and sensitive issues that benefit substantially from the fact that we do not treat ourselves as isolated know-alls, but share our learning and our knowledge with, giving to and taking from the countries of Europe. Before I sit down, let me return to the good neighbour principle, because it is on that basis that I am quite sure, regardless of selfish interest, we should stay in this body that we elected to join, that we engage in with our own people being their civil servants or our civil servants, that we engage in through the Council of Ministers, through the European Parliament and through the Commission. I'm quite sure we should stay with this body because we joined it. If it has shortcomings, we can bring about changes in those shortcomings. But we should not allow ourselves to be called again, as we are already being called, perfidious Albion, treacherous England, a word on the lips of the French since, some say, the 13th century. We are now indeed being called deserters, and that's wholly unappealing, but it would be accurate. Let me conclude as I concluded one of my Gresham lectures, so I apologise for repetition to those who were there. Overall, the good neighbour principle was reflected by Charles Darwin in a passage from The Descent of Man, in which he said that advances in civilization of small tribes moving into larger tribes showed that by the simplest logic, nothing to do with religion or anything of that sort, man should understand that his social instincts and his sympathies should be extended in his own interest. First to, as it were, his village, then his town, then his country. And as Darwin explains, once you make that understanding, there's nothing to stop him extending those sympathies and understanding to everyone. Well, it might be a bit much, I suppose, to hope that over here we'd really extend those sympathies to the continent from which we all originate, whatever their problems, as they try to cross the sea to Europe. But what I think we can say, building on that principle, and without regard to selfish interest, is that the boundary, the garden fence, should not be at Hadrian's Wall, and it should not be along the English Channel. And we should stay in this union that we have joined, improve it as we may, but stay with it, be loyal to it, and be loyal to ourselves. Just go up there.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I want to start by just addressing two of the points made by Sir Geoffrey in his very good opening remarks. The first one is on the good neighbour principle. I'm not an academic or a professor or a QC, so I won't have the eloquence of some of the people on the panel. But it does strike me that if you look across history, there have been many examples of unions that have been and gone. Just to name a few examples, you might have the British Empire, which was a union of kinds which came and went. You have the Soviet Union, another union of countries that came and went. And I'm trying to think of a third example, and I might talk about the former Yugoslavia. And I can't think of many countries within the former Yugoslavia who would now want to still be within that particular union. So I think unions do come and go, and times do pass. The second point I want to make is that I imagine that Gresham College, 15 years ago, when Britain was debating whether or not to join the euro, I imagine there were similar debates put on by Gresham College, where you had speakers here saying, look at all these international bodies, look at all these government departments, look at all these heads of government from overseas who are telling us that we should join the euro. Surely the British public shouldn't be given a say on this. Surely the British public aren't capable of making up their minds on such an important subject. Surely we should go along with what these great bodies say, and Britain should join the euro. So the second point I'd make is that actually, I think the British people do have a right to have a say on this issue, and I actually think the decision they come up with will be the right common sense issue, despite any bullying from international bodies and other government departments. But moving on to what I want to say tonight. The case I want to put to you is that leaving the EU is the forward-looking and the secure choice for Britain. And above all, that it's a democratic choice for the UK. There was once a David Cameron who you could easily imagine standing here making that case. Indeed, Steve Hilton, one of his closest friends and his policy guru, said as much yesterday in a lecture, saying that were David Cameron not Prime Minister, he'd be part of the Leave side. And it was that Eurosceptic David Cameron who laid into what he called the EU's, quote, desire for harmonisation and regulation, the last gasp of an outdated ideology. Then, in 2013, he set out his plan to renegotiate Britain's membership of the EU and said that the union had become so unaccountable that, quote, democratic consent is now wafer thin. So what happened between then and now? Well, he went to Brussels for his renegotiation, but there were basically no takers. And at Business of Britain, the organisation I ran, we despaired when he basically achieved nothing, and that's why we're now on the Leave side of this debate. And I think it's a shame that the Prime Minister himself didn't draw the same conclusion, the conclusion that there is no reformed EU on offer in this referendum. Instead, he has thrown away his ambitions. This referendum is about whether we want to leave, but for one moment, try flipping the question around. Ask yourself, is this an organisation you'd want to join? We were told when we joined that we would not be giving up any sovereignty. But in reality, EU bureaucrats, who no one ever voted for, now write 6 in 10 of our laws. The EU is then sold as a great engine of economic progress. But the EU is now the world's slowest growing continent. The single market was promoted as a way for our businesses to sprint forwards. But Brussels has put rocks in their rucksacks. It spews out regulation that costs our economy £600 million every week. The EU was meant to bring Europe together, but its disastrous policies of forcing through borderless continent and a single currency have sown division and misery. So many of the alleged experts now warning of doom if we leave the EU are the same ones who said we should join the euro. And thank goodness that we didn't listen to them, and we shouldn't now. The EU club isn't just taking away our democracy, it's charging an eye-watering membership fee for doing so, about £350 million a week, which will be enough to build an NHS hospital every 7 days. That's close to 20 billion gross every year, or 10 billion net. So, ladies and gentlemen, knowing what we know now, would you vote to join the club? Would it really be the safe option for the UK? Don't just take my word for it. Look at some of the West European countries outside of the EU. The pro-Brussels crowd say that those nations get a raw deal for not being members. So why then has Norway twice rejected membership in referendums and rejected it by crushing majorities? In opinion polls today, 72% of Norwegians are against membership. So are 82% of people in Switzerland. They're not even tempted to join the club. So would you be? Well, you might say, okay, isn't this all a bit hypothetical, a bit of a game? The fact is we're in the EU currently. Why throw it in the air? Surely the status quo is the safer option. Well, I think that's wrong. The fact is there is no status quo on offer. Europe is trying to map a way out of the Eurozone crisis. As usual, EU tunnel vision sees just one route: centralisation, integration, taking away more power from nation states. As Matteo Renzi, the Italian PM, puts it, "For my children's future, I dream, think and work for a United States of Europe." So you can't accuse the EU of hiding its goals. How to reach those goals is clearly laid out also in the 5 Presidents' report, published last year. It calls for the transfer of power over tax, the financial system, and the legal system to Brussels, as well as full fiscal, economic and political union of the single currency area. Institutions like the European Parliament and Commission will be reborn as organs of the Eurozone, and our influence in Britain as a non-Eurozone member state will wither. To make things worse, the Prime Minister recklessly abandoned our veto on Eurozone integration, even when it has knock-on effects in the UK. If we stay in this project, it'll be like bumping along in the back of a taxi with dodgy sat-nav where the driver doesn't listen to a word we say. We'll be constantly trying to fend off damaging power grabs. They'll step up their hostile attacks on the City of London. They'll drag us into bailing out the Eurozone, into the European army, which is starting to take shape. We've even had an EU battle group training in Salisbury Plain just last week. Saying the EU is about economics, not politics, is like saying the Italian mafia is in the property and olive oil business. Sort of true, but not really the point. The aim of building a country called Europe is very different from any other international agreement where, yes, you always give up a bit of freedom of action. The EU goes further. It takes away the power even to make those agreements, along with wide areas of democratic decision-making. The European Commissioners are rather fond of power without accountability. They openly deride democracy, like their swatting aside of the Greek people's referendum vote against austerity, or when the Trade Commissioner said of the TTIP negotiations with the USA, "I do not take my mandate from the European people." Or when Jean-Claude Juncker, the Commission President, said, ludicrously, that if Britain withdrew from the EU after a democratic decision taken in accordance with EU treaties, we would be treated as deserters. By taking back our democracy, we can control our own decisions and re-engage with the world. There are so many areas, vital areas of national life where we've lost control and not even had a meaningful democratic debate in decades because we've given away the power to make decisions. Like farming and fisheries, like international trade. We took the gospel of free trade around the world, but now our global trade is organised in secret in Brussels, in shady trade-offs between pressure groups and vested interests in multinational corporations. New ideas and new competition get crushed. And we'll at last be able to take back control of our borders. This will mean we can design a fairer, better managed migration system to protect both our public services and our national security. This becomes even more urgent with nearly 90 million people from Turkey and 4 other low-income countries being lined up for membership and free movement across the EU. We can bring in bigger business regulation that powers growth, a system designed for Britain, not Portugal or Latvia. Politicians and civil servants will no longer be able to blame stupid rules on Brussels. So we can cast off the shackles of Brussels, or we can be a bit part player in a Europe that's heading in a direction we don't want. As that sham renegotiation proved, it's pointless to think that we can change the EU from the inside. If we remain, it's been suggested that in a few years, quote, Britain will have to confront a choice between taking part in greater integration, including during the euro, or an uncertain future. Those are the words of Peter Mandelson. And as a committed Eurosceptic, I say to you, I agree with Peter Mandelson. We have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity in this referendum to take control of our country. I hope Britain takes hold of that opportunity and votes leave on the 23rd of June. Thank you.
Good evening, and may I first of all apologise that 3 votes in the House of Commons at 5 o'clock, which ran till nearly 5:45, made me slightly late for the start of this fascinating debate. I'd like to start with some reflections, really, on my own time in government. As Attorney General from 2010 to 2014, I had plenty of opportunities to see how the EU was working and the impact on our country. The EU and its institutions exist to give effect to treaties which the 28 member states have agreed to intended to create a single market in goods and services, promote cooperation in other fields, including environmental protection, health and safety, security, and policing. The United Kingdom enjoys a very special position in not being bound by some parts of the EU treaties, particularly those referring to the Eurozone. But I'm the first to accept as a lawyer that legal interpretation of what a treaty obligation is can be complex. We don't always get the outcomes for which we argue, either from the Commission, which administers the working of the EU, or sometimes indeed from cases which I've taken personally to the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg. In addition, while we enjoy a veto over key areas of the treaties, exceptional vetoes, other parts are by our consent subject to qualified majority voting, so we don't always get our way, despite our dissent. Although it's worth bearing in mind that the number of times we have been outvoted, which is often quoted a little over 70, it's worth pointing out that we've also agreed on about just under 3,000 occasions. So some of the issues with which I dealt could be frustrating. And there are valid criticisms that can be made of the EU's operation and the way it's developed, particularly in the current crisis that besets the Eurozone. But none of these criticisms persuade me that we would be better off leaving. By virtue of joining up in 1973, we opened a period of progressive national economic revival. And those of you who remember what Britain was like before in the 1970s will know that we were indeed the sick man of Europe. And that economic revival, with a few blips, has continued to this day. It's witnessed a massive expansion in our trade in goods and services with other EU countries, which now stands at 45% of our exports. And our service sector, which is the principal area in which the United Kingdom has developed in the last half century, and makes up about 75% of all our global exports, and is of exceptional importance to us, particularly here in the City of London, has benefited particularly because the reality is that many countries, despite the aspirations people give to free trade, are in reality very protectionist and very adept at excluding foreign service providers at the behest of their own interest groups. And indeed, the European single market in services is not yet complete, but at least it's moving in the right direction. And we've also enjoyed a growth in prosperity based on the arrival of inward investment. It's seen the United Kingdom as the perfect base for entering the EU market. The automotive industry has revived on the back of it and is now exporting more cars than we consume here. The financial sector in the city has benefited enormously. My own constituency in the Thames Valley, it is a plethora of pharmaceutical companies, many from the United States, that are using Britain not only as their base to do business here, but also as their base to do business in Europe. And it's worth bearing in mind that this hasn't always been the case. I was struck today because I was meeting a group of French businessmen who pointed out that in the 1970s, 50% of large American corporations had their corporate headquarters in Paris. And there is hardly a single one left there today. The consequence both of the United Kingdom joining the European Union, the common language, and Mrs. Thatcher's sensible fiscal policies in making this an attractive place to invest. The French, I can assure you, are just waiting for us to leave the EU to try and get those businesses back again. The EU's negotiating power as a market of 500 million peoples also helped unlock markets further afield where tariffs and protection are a real issue. It's very much work in progress, but the suggestion that we can somehow replicate overnight the more than 50 agreements that have been achieved to date in a world that is becoming more and more protectionist seems to me to be fanciful. And we need to keep that in mind and the advantages of the European Union in terms of achieving greater clout. As well as my time as Attorney General, I'm chairman of the Intelligence and Security Committee. I have to say to you bluntly, I've heard some real absurd arguments being put forward about the EU undermining our national security. I have to say, with slight regret, I heard another one this evening about Salisbury Plain battle groups. Let's be quite clear on the matter. Our principal defence umbrella is NATO, and that is going to continue in future, and the EU battle group is wholly compatible, the battle group between we've put together is wholly compatible with our NATO membership. The sharing of high-level intelligence, which is one of the things I have to superintend, can also be done at a bilateral level and can doubtless continue. But the development of formal structures of police cooperation, easier extradition of suspects and sharing databases, which is essential to counter-terrorism, is in fact facilitated by the EU in very substantial measure. Of course, we have our relations with the Five Eyes countries, Canada, Australia, New Zealand and the US. Not one single one of them has ever suggested to me that staying in the EU would be a disadvantage in terms of building our security. On the contrary, because most of the terrorism now originates in the European and Middle Eastern area, our key partners in counter-terrorism are in fact France, Spain, Germany, Italy and the Scandinavian states. So I have to say that leaving the EU, I think, is quite a difficult strategy in terms of security. Of course, we might be able to replicate those structures at a bilateral level and involve ourselves in them. But it seems to me to be very odd that Matthew Elliott might not object to our having joint operations with other European countries on Salisbury Plain, but apparently it's the fact that it might have been facilitated by the EU which bothers him. I have to say I'm just not very bothered, because it is compatible with NATO, which is our principal pillar of defence. And I've not heard anything else to make me believe that we would be better off out. Brexiters appear to have split views about the sort of model they want for our relationship outside. I know the official position is now a World Trade Organization agreement with special privileges for the United Kingdom. Others have argued that we should stay in the European Economic Area, in which case we would continue to be bound by every vast majority of the regulations, whilst we would have no influence over their creation, which is in fact the fate of Norway. Matthew Elliott mentioned unions and pointed out other unions that have broken up. But the feature of those unions was that they weren't voluntary. This is a voluntary union. And actually, the old Balkan states of old Yugoslavia are queuing up to try to join it, not to split themselves away. Leaving will undoubtedly raise prices here, and the evidence is overwhelming it will cause a short-term economic shock. Where we'll be in 10 or 20 years' time, neither of us on the other side of the argument knows. But it's a very odd thing, it seems to me, when we're just pulling ourselves out of recession to suddenly decide that what we're going to do is to create a new one. The Five Presidents report mentioned by Matthew Elliott, I have to say I've read it. It is not a blueprint for some hideous European state. It's a blueprint for trying to get the Eurozone out of its present crisis. And this is where I don't understand the argument either. If we leave the EU, then presumably the Five Presidents project will go ahead, or it may do in some form. Are we better off with the special privileges we have being outside the Eurozone but still in the EU, or doing the very thing which British foreign policy has tried to avoid for generations, which is allowing a bloc to be created in Europe in which we don't have any involvement? I don't follow the argument. And I worry too that much of the current debate is being conducted on a false view of national self-interest. Me, 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 me. The lessons of our history are that the well-being of our neighbours on the continent is critical to our own. The arc of conflict that is now running from Russia down through the Middle East threatens us all. And it's very much to our advantage to support our neighbours and to work with them in order to take us through this period of challenge and crisis. Leaving the EU will add to the challenge and crisis. It'll certainly upset our European partners, some of whom rely on the United Kingdom's independent look and slight detachment from the Eurozone to in fact provide some of the pragmatism that is much needed in Europe's development. I think particularly of the Scandinavians, of Sweden and Denmark and also the Netherlands. They will lose our leadership. The project will go ahead without our input. And that makes, to my mind, the idea and suggestion that we are in some way going to achieve highly preferential agreements with people who we have effectively just rejected a partnership with entirely fanciful. Of course they're going to want to deal with us, but I don't think they owe us any favours in right of what we will have decided to do. And I think they will seek to drive hard bargains where the leverage is actually on their side, because ultimately some of the states have very few trading relationships with us, and there has to be unanimity. If we vote to remain, the one thing that is not affected is our sovereignty. The argument that sovereignty is involved in this issue is a misunderstanding of what sovereignty is about. It's our absolute right to withdraw completely from the European Union at any time we'd wish by giving notice under Article 50. I would add it is not our right to do as has been suggested by some members of the Vote Leave campaign, vote, have a referendum, decide to leave, then not invoke Article 50 and start passing legislation in breach of our treaty obligations. That is the way to international anarchy and illustrates to my mind that they haven't thought through what they're doing. In this sense, the EU treaty is no different from the 13,200 treaties that we've signed up to since 1834 and are still in force. Over 700 of them have got arbitral mechanisms by which disputes over interpretation can be resolved. Many of them were entered into in the heyday of Britain's empire. And why? Because our forebears knew that the best way of achieving a better, safer world was to bind people together by international rules and obligations and have an international rules-based system. It's not perfect, but there is no alternative. We entered into them because we, as a sovereign nation, considered it was in our national self-interest to do it. It's exactly the same reason why we joined the EU in 1973. And despite the organisation's problems and its shortcomings, which exists in my experience in every human institution, it has kept the peace, it has increased prosperity for its participants, even though there have been periods when mistakes have been made. And it has, above all, tried in a very dangerous and difficult world to provide a zone of peace, democracy, security and the rule of law, which chimes exactly with the national values which we have. Our willingness to engage internationally, including in the EU, is the heart of our success as a nation, and we should strive to build on it, not destroy the good that we've achieved. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everybody, and I apologise for being slightly overdressed, but unfortunately I have to go to another dinner where I'm also speaking, fortunately not on this subject, for once, but on the subject of philanthropy, which is not, of course, unconnected with Gresham College. But tonight, my proposition is simple. It'll be exciting, cathartic, and prosperous for the UK to leave the EU. It will be dangerous and costly to remain. Back in 1975, and in common with millions who will support Vote Leave on the 23rd of June, I voted for Britain to remain in what was on the tin, a European Economic Community, the EEC. Sadly, what has crept up on us by stealth over these 40 years is an increasingly blighted, stagnant single market and a political project based on ever closer union and spearheaded by the Eurozone. Back in 1975, I think it was Jeffrey said, we were down and out, at the mercy of the IMF and exhausted. Now, we are a proud trading and cultural nation again, the fifth largest economy and exporter in the world. Imagine, some people predict that we'll overtake Germany in the next 15 years. We are also the world's fourth military power, and after the US, the mainstay of NATO. quite right, Dominic mentioned this, which, and not the EU, has principally kept the peace in Europe since World War II. We are an admired and respected world leader in many diverse areas, speaking the global language English, the city and financial services, technology, media, arts and culture, parliamentary democracy and philanthropy. We are also members of G7 and G20 and a permanent member of the UN Security Council, all of which potentially are at risk from the EU anyway. We are indeed, if I can use an old-fashioned expression, a great power. And none of these attributes, or not many, have very much to do with our membership of the European Union. So, what would Brexit look like? Well, pretty attractive, really. As I say, exciting, prosperous, and cathartic, and far from the fanciful defeatist fear-mongering going on at Remain headquarters. They remind me of that perceptive remark by William Hague. The Conservative Party has two states, complacency and panic. No prizes where Downing Street is at the moment. So here are the facts, spoken not with passion, but based on fact. In 2005, Gordon Brown, that now incorrigible Remainer, estimated that the cost of EU regulation was 6% of GDP, or 96 billion per annum. Think what economic benefit that would have to the 95% of UK businesses who do no business outside our country. What a massive stimulus to the economy. Shaking over such overregulation, we'll become increasingly competitive in the global economy, where our current share, which is rising, 58% if you include what's called the Rotterdam effect, and there are people here who explain what that is, of our exports go. And that has risen from about 51% over the last 4 or 5 years. We will be able to do our own trade deals, an ability we lost in 1973. What you perhaps may not all know is that even with the apparent might of the EU behind us, we have only 63% of our exports covered by such deals. So compare independent nations like Australia and Canada, who respectively have more, 69% and 77%. And then that's hardly surprising when you look at the EU's hopeless track record. Take the so-called TTIP, 10 years on, as an example, as Matthew referred, of getting 28 nations to agree to such a deal, like herding cats in a bag. As a wide and experienced politician once said, probably of the EU and so-called success, success in the EU is like stumbling from failure to failure with no loss of enthusiasm. It would be simple for us to replace existing EU trade deals with the UK as a signature in its own right, largely technical rather than commercial, and theoretically quick, and to get on with a deal with the US, regardless of what President Obama says, who won't be in the White House for very much longer. We'd soon be up with the Canadians and the Australians. And of course, we'll be able to do a much better deal than any other nation with a stagnant EU because of our overwhelming bargaining power. And it's interesting just to reflect that my wife and I have just come back from Greece, and all our Greek friends want us to vote leave. No prizes for guessing why. So let's take our leverage. We have a massive trade deficit with the EU. They overwhelmingly exceed in terms of what they export into our country, by what we sell them, 62 billion. And there's the continuing attraction of the British economy as one of the most vibrant economies in the world. There are the 5 to 6.5 million people, depending on various estimates, who are employed in industries exporting from the EU to the UK, based in nations whose average unemployment level is double ours at 10%. There are the global multinationals who've declared their willingness to continue their commitment to Britain in the event of Brexit. Names like Toyota, General Motors, BMW, VW, Airbus, Jaguar, Land Rover, Honda, and Boeing. And yes, Geoffrey, good neighbourliness, yes, it's prescribed and promoted in Article 8 of the Lisbon Treaty, and we are and will be a massively important neighbour. And if we don't achieve this, which is most unlikely, nothing will change in our relationship with the EU for the 2 years after we, quite correctly, Dominic, invoke Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty. Thereafter, we're bound by the terms of our newly acquired membership of the World Trade Organization, which will create an average and bearable tariff of around 4%. But perhaps more importantly is the fact that we have the opportunity to have cheaper food, given that the tariff barriers imposed by the Common Agricultural Policy mean food prices are 20% above the average free market level in the rest of the world. In short, much of the Common Agricultural Policy has been largely at the expense of third world farmers, yes. And who was it who said, what is it that allows European states to go spreading civilization and ethics in foreign parts, but not at home? And we'll once more be able to open our borders to talented people to work, for instance, in the city, where very able New Yorkers find it hugely difficult to reside, and to students from every nation in the world to study at our universities, which are complaining about the difficulties of obtaining visas. And I should make a point which was referred to earlier, that one of Britain's most successful traits has been their ability to absorb and integrate minorities. Romans, Angles, Saxons, Jutes, Normans, Hasidic and Sephardic Jews, Huguenots, and in the last century, Afro-Caribbeans and Asians. All for their and our good, yes. But we've done that until we joined the EU by controlling our borders with care and wherever possible with compassion, and not overtaxing unprepared British public services. And the city, which is my background, will thrive like the rest of the economy as it becomes increasingly able to dominate global financial services against competitors such as New York, Singapore, and Hong Kong. It too will shake off over-regulation and hated measures, to be a little bit technical, I apologize for those who aren't involved in the city, like financial transaction tax, bonus caps, and short selling bans. And it's already got 80% of the non-UK EU capital market business is done here, although financial service exports to the EU are down to 33% of our total financial service exports, from 39% 10 years ago, compared, for instance, with 31% to the US. And of course, our continued membership of G7, G20, IOSCO, and so on and so forth, all at risk from the EU, as I said before, will ensure that we continue to have the same regulatory framework as the rest of the EU, but not over-regulation. So I will say this, continental rivals may try their damnedest, but London has all the cards. You'll be able to attract the best of talent from anywhere in the world by being able to control our borders. The depths and markets and ancillary services would take a generation to replace elsewhere. I think Dominic mentioned the fact that people move from Paris. If you know something about employment circumstances in Paris, and indeed the 50% higher corporation tax and higher personal tax, you'll know the reason why. That is why 90% of US investment banks' EU staff are based in London. They may go for a journey on Eurostar, but they'll be back. And I will also say, in fact, I think it was Dominic who referred to it, that there are 72 measures opposed by Britain since 1996. Actually, the important point to make is this is accelerating, and 40 of them were since 2010. And that is why Remain is both costly and dangerous. Frankly, there's not a lot we can do about it. The constitution of the EU is Byzantine, but at its heart is the concept of qualified majority voting, and effectively control to the Eurozone, because our voting in the various institutions is between 10 and 13%. And usually that's in secrecy, and in the case of the European Commission, which is the only body that can propose legislation, you have to undertake, if you're a member, not to represent the interest of your nation. That's an interesting comparison with the openness of, for instance, parliamentary question time. So I suppose you also sometimes wonder where the Foreign Office stands in the EU debate, which reminds you of the chap who was lost in Whitehall and went up to a copper and asked him, which side is the Foreign Office on, please? Quick as a flash came the reply, that's a very good question. So I will actually deal with one issue which Dominic raised and then conclude. Security. I'm going to quote two people, Sir Richard Dearlove, former head of MI6, who believes that we would be safer outside the EU for two reasons. One, because it would be easier to deport terrorists to control borders. And secondly, and this is a direct quote, Britain is Europe's leader in intelligence and security measures and gives much more than it gets in return. And General Sir Michael Rose, great military man, recently said, sovereignty and security are intrinsically linked, and in the recent years, we've seen the EU erode our sovereignty. And so there's not much hope. And to end this sorry tale of constitutional disenfranchisement, which is where I was before, let's consider the European Court of Justice, not the European Court of Human Rights. Geoffrey was absolutely right about that. The ECJ stands above our Supreme Court, and our Supreme Court is comprised of our most distinguished judges. Now, in the ECJ, we can appoint only one of 28, and the horrifying fact is that many of them are elected political appointments with mere law degrees, and only 1/3, and these are people who are passing judgment on things which are going to affect us directly, only 1/3 have previous judicial experience. That is an example of constitutional ineptitude. And I think that the ECJ is a good place to rest my case. The current president of the European Court of Justice, Koen Leenaerts, in an interview to the Wall Street Journal recently, confirmed that the court uses the preamble to the Maastricht Treaty as a guide. Let me tell you what the Maastricht Treaty says. It says to continue the process of creating an ever closer union amongst the peoples of Europe. That is a guide for the European Court of Justice. So, remain dangerous and costly. Leave exciting, cathartic, and prosperous. No more to be said.